our latest webinar, Managing Insider Risk versus Insider Threats. I'm delighted to be joined today by our special guest, Nick Cavalancia, Microsoft MVP. My name is David Morrow, and I head up marketing here at Awareness Technologies, which is the parent company of Veriado. And our special guest, Nick, he is a Microsoft Cloud and Data Center MVP. He has over 28 years of enterprise IT experience, is an accomplished consultant, speaker, trainer, writer, and columnist, and has achieved industry certifications including MCSE, MCT, Master CNE, and Master CNI. He has authored, co-authored, and contributed to dozens of books on various technologies. He regularly speaks, writes, and blogs for some of the most recognized tech companies today on topics including cybersecurity, cloud adoption, business continuity, and compliance. You can follow Nick on Twitter at Nick Cavalancia or at Tech Evangelism. So we're absolutely delighted to have Nick with us today and very honored. Nick is going to kick us off by going through a few slides on managing insider risk versus insider threats. And then myself and Nick are going to have a fireside chat style Q&A after the slides. So over to you, Nick.
Wonderful. Thanks, David. Appreciate you having me here today. It's an honor, as always. For all of you, the idea of insider risk is one of those things where we have so much focus being put on the external threat actor that sometimes, at least I see it from kind of an outsider's perspective, looking at organizations where the insider threat sort of gets put to the wayside. And today we really want to focus on looking at sort of the state of the insider, but also sort of defining this idea between insider threat and insider risk, and where you should be placing your focus. So I'm going to start off with the state of the insider, and I'm a big believer in looking at industry data because it paints a picture of what the industry looks like. I'm not a believer in FUD. This is not about trying to put a lot of fear and, oh my gosh, you have to worry about this, because that's not the point. It's more of let's take some statistically relevant data and some good sample sizes and figure out what is happening in the industry. The first data point that I've got here actually comes from a company called Egress. It's their Insider Data Breach Survey. And according to them, 94% of organizations have had some kind of insider incident. And two things I want to point out to that. One, the word incident. Doesn't necessarily mean that something was successful. May have been something very minor, might have been a negligent user, a malicious user, an accidental insider, a user insider of any of those three types. But also is you might look at that 94% and go, that seems really high. Like, we don't think we've had one, that kind of thing. So even if you don't agree with the number, it's some material percentage. It certainly is. It's not 10% of organizations have had some kind of insider incident. It's something material. The second one comes from SonicWall's Cyber Threat Report. And this one here is 36% of organizations are concerned about accidental insider incident. So that could be, I accidentally shared something out on OneDrive that I shouldn't have, it made it publicly available or put on a website, or maybe I clicked a link on a phishing email, those kinds of things. From that same report, 33% though are concerned about malicious insider incidents. We're certainly talking about an actual internal user in the organization that's acting maliciously on their own. So a true insider threat. Another one here, it comes from the Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report. My favorite report of all comes out about March or April every year. Read it. It's a great report. In there, they normally focus on a lot about external threats and data breaches that result from it, as well as just security incidents. But this year, around 22%, it was pulled from a graph that's somewhere between 21 and 22%. I'm not sure the same exact number, but 20% of the breaches you can see there involved in some way, shape, or form an internal actor. Now, that could mean that it was fully on, the internal threat actor was the one that went somewhere they weren't supposed to go, or misused credentials, or did something, and they went and got data, or it could have been they participated and they clicked on that malicious link in a phishing email, but somehow involved an internal threat actor. In fact, in that same report, 85% of all breaches involve some kind of human factor in it. So it's not just purely automated or an external attacker gaining access through a vulnerability and so on. There's some human element somewhere in there. And then the last one here, it comes from, this is from IBM's Cost of a Data Breach report from last year. There's no new one out yet this year. But you can see 4.61 million for malicious insiders. And again, if you don't agree with the number, because you might go, Nick, come on, our organization is much smaller than that. It's not going to be 4.6 million. Okay, but it's still material. It's not $100,000. It's not $10,000. It's measured in the millions. So kind of take that to heart at least. And so then they get on this question of, insider risk versus insider threats. That was the topic of today's webcast. And looking at, okay, great, the insider is an issue. What am I looking at? Should I be looking at risk? Should I be looking at threats? And I put on this sort of comparison chart, if you will. I'm going to bring up one on each side and kind of talk about it briefly here. Risk is about the threat potential. It's about the fact that something might happen, but it hasn't yet. So versus insider threats, we're talking about an existent, clear, present danger, a threat that's existing. Someone is stealing data or something that has already happened is the threat. So the threat is, it is happening right now. It's like, the difference of risk is go walking down some dark alley in somewhere in the middle of Manhattan in a shady part of the neighborhood or something, right? That's risk. It's risky. But threat is someone coming at you at night with a knife open. And that's different, right? They're two different things. So risk and threats. Insider risk, typically, if you're trying to manage insider risk, we're talking about days before it actually happens, even months before it happens. There are abilities today to look at lots of leading indicators that let you handle this issue before it ever happens for truly an insider threat, or even if it's, let's say, a malicious external threat actor that's taken over an insider's credentials, which I'll talk about more a little later on today. The insider threat, however, we're talking about days to months, usually after. And if you're thinking about, well, I'm being really responsive, I have great solutions in place that are monitoring, well, it's still, let's call it the day of, right? It's still measured in a day. It's the one day. It took you less than one day to do it, but we're still talking about afterwards. And then for insider risk, our focus is always on those leading indicators I mentioned earlier. It's on looking on things like, is this behavior, abnormal? There are linguistic indicators. Let's say the user even going from largely positive to largely negative about the organization, them using lots of I's and we's instead of, I's and me's instead of us's and we's. I mean, that can even be a leading indicator of maybe someone who's an insider is changing their mindset about, man, I deserve that raise, and how come I was overpassed, and someone else got that job, and I deserve it. There are ways you can tell that way. So there are leading indicators and behavioral indicators. They're going to a job site a million times, and they normally don't, or they're accessing files and copying down a lot more files than they normally do, or something along those lines. There's lots of leading indicators versus a threat is you're looking at the threat actions. What did they do? It's investigative. And you're trying to uncover that. With insider risk, the goal is different. You're trying to minimize the risk. So you use those leading indicators. For example, if you have a user that is very unhappy, let's just take the unhappy user that's leaving and they're going to take data with them when they leave. It's a salesperson. They take a copy of all their customers, right? You can minimize that risk by just identifying that they're unhappy. And then talk to them with HR. What's it at? Well, it could be just something simple. I wanted a parking spot. I didn't get one. Whatever it is, I don't know. But you deal with the risk as opposed to you have to actually understand the scope of the threat afterward. That's really what you're doing. You're doing all that investigative work to understand what actually happened, what data was stolen. If you look at data breach notification laws, you have to be able to understand the scope of a data breach. Otherwise, you have to assume for most of those laws that exist that all the data has been stolen, even though we both know it hasn't. But you have to if you can't prove what the scope was. So there's a difference in the focus here. Insider risk was reliant a lot on AI. It's looking at abnormalities. What is not normal for that user? Or for that user compared to themselves, that user compared to a group of peers, that user compared to everybody in the organization, using AI, using some kind of intelligence to figure that out, versus insider threats, using indicators of compromise, you can get that artifacts that exist, threat actions, certainly those same kinds of, look, that user copied the 50 files down the USB stick. That's weird. But the idea is that you're looking at it as an artifact or an after the fact kind of thing there. And then the last part is just, you can tell at this point, insider risk and managing risk is about being proactive, and managing threats is about being reactive. And then the last thing I want to talk about before you and I get into our conversation is just looking at this from sort of a maturity standpoint. For those in the audience, you're trying to figure out, well, how mature is our program to try and deal with insider threats, insider risk? And this is actually a quick snapshot from an insider threat program maturity model that I built with Veriata back in 2019. While it hasn't been updated in the last 3 years, the maturity model is still the same. There's some reporting data where people are, and that's the timely part. But this thing is really kind of static. It represents 5 levels of maturity when you're dealing with insider threats. And you can see things like non-existent. Okay, they have nothing. It's just we're not even paying attention to the problem. Okay, fine. Reactive. I know they exist. If something happens, we'll deal with it. That's what reactive is. Proactive is we have some tools in place that if something happens, we can spot it when it happens. When a threat happens, we can actually definitely do something about it. We can tell that it happened. And then we've got predictive, which is now we're trying to figure out how to look at potential threats. And that's actually right there in the middle of that paragraph underneath it in yellow is the word potential. So we're looking at risk now. And then optimize is like predictive, but looking at it from a standpoint where you're constantly evolving it based on how the organization changes. So we're looking at where we find the dividing line between if you're managing, well, you can't really manage threats, but threats versus risk. The dividing line is right here. It's right here in the middle, and everything to the left is basically not even dealing with risk. It's just looking at threats, if that. I mean, non-existent is, what is it, an ostrich, right? Sticks their head in the sand, David, is that right? When they're scared? Okay. Yeah, that's right, you're on mute, but I saw the nod. That's good enough.
I believe so, yes, the ostrich head.
Yes, so non-existent is the proverbial ostrich, but the other two are still just looking for threats at different levels. Either we'll deal with it or we have some solutions that can tell when it happens, but they're not looking at, proactively. So thinking of it from that perspective, you're really trying to be predictive. You're really trying to optimize if you're trying to be thinking about managing insider risk. So with that, David, I'll sort of, pass the proverbial baton back to you. I know you and I have a bit of discussion we're going to have as well, and I'm happy to do that.
Thank you very much, Nick. I mean, that's very insightful and hopefully a very good overview for people of the real differences between insider risk and insider threats. I'm certainly as relatively new to this industry myself, it's very helpful for me to get that perspective. So what I'd like to do now is just throw some questions at you, Nick. I mean, you've got a whole wealth of knowledge in your head there, so I want to tap into that and help our audience understand some of these themes a little bit more deeply. And I should just say for the audience, and I should have said this at the beginning, due to some scheduling conflicts, we are recording today's webinar. So when you see this played out in the broadcast, it will actually be a recording. So we won't be able to answer questions live today. However, that doesn't stop us being able to take questions. Please post your questions in the chat function, and we will be monitoring those questions come in, and we will be able to get back to you with a response after the broadcast on Tuesday. So, okay, let's get started. So, Nick, you showed us some quite mind-blowing numbers at the beginning of your slide presentation. So, how big a problem is the insider?
So it's interesting is go back to the Verizon data. 22% of breaches involve an insider. That seems really small, but I see it this way. I think it's very small because the other math, 78%, 100 minus 22, is supposed to be an external threat actor. But think of the pure opportunistic nature of external threats. Someone can literally do an automated scan of every port that exists on every IP address around the entire planet, and they didn't do any work. They just simply said go and pressed a button. So it's very easy, and that's why there's this massive magnitude of external threats that exist. But the fact that it's still 22%, that tells me that's a really huge problem to watch. At the same time, though, a couple other stats from the Verizon Data Breach Investigation Report that I wrote down here, I've got them in front of me, that weren't on the screen. 61% of breaches involve the misuse of credentials. Now, that's two factors. One is, for those of you that are watching today, you're an IT person that has some kind of elevated credentials, and you give them to a colleague to go log into server 5 so they can go do something, and instead they misuse those credentials and log into server 6 and steal some data. Go with the example, but you get the point. That's one factor, someone who's actually misusing a credential that's internal in the organization. The other side of that is the external threat actor that then finds a set of elevated credentials and misuses them within the organization as well. So putting aside that 22%, 61% is sort of that carryover, that crossover stat that says, okay, great. The small portion over here on this side is the insider threat, but this big portion is the external. 61% across all those is definitely someone misusing credentials. Second stat is 82% of ransomware attacks. This actually comes from, I take this back, it's from Coveware's quarterly ransomware report they put out. They're a company that helps with ransomware responses. And 82% of ransomware attacks involve lateral movement. And they were using the MITRE ATT&CK framework definition of lateral movement. So if 82% of ransomware attacks, as an example, are moving laterally, that means they have an internal credential and they look like an insider 82% of the time. So this is one of those things where even when you go, I'm not really worried about Bob or Susie or Sally or Tommy, that's not always who we're talking about when we talk about the insider. We're talking about watching Bob or Tommy or Susie, Sally's account, because they might be the ones that are misused by an external threat actor as well. So really, when we're talking about watching the insider, we're talking about insider threats, but we're also talking about trying to minimize the risk of someone externally misusing an internal credential.
Because the vast majority of insider it's not intentional, right? People, it's not non-intentional, right? So it's okay. That's fascinating. And you've talked about insiders, and we've just talked about that a little bit. How do external threat actors target insiders? As I just mentioned, a lot of it's not intentional, but it still happens. So how does that happen?
Okay, so there's a couple ways. If you think about the cyber kill chain, as it were, so a generic concept at this point, because I'm not talking about a specific one. Threat actors will come in a number of ways. Now, they always come in one of three ways, in pretty much in any type of situation. Let me back up. The insider threat actor, it's going to be just obviously they're using their own credential or misusing someone else's. That's simple. But to answer your question, the external threat actors target three ways. They're using a vulnerability, so something like a 0-day, or someone hasn't patched something in 7 years, and it's a 7-year-old vulnerability, that kind of thing. Coming in through RDP, through a brute force attack, which means they're gaining access to somebody somewhere, even if it's just an administrative account that doesn't belong to a person, but some credential somewhere inside. Or they're utilizing phishing attacks to then take over an endpoint and therefore someone's credentials, and then figure out ways to give themselves either again through a vulnerability, or maybe they're skimming through RAM with Mimikatz and they go ahead and pull out a password hash or a Kerberos ticket they're going to try and break, or even a clear text password if it exists. Sometimes passwords are stored in the registry. There's lots of ways they can gain access to a credential. And then from that point forward, it's laterally moving and trying that same thing over and over again until they get sort of the right credential. The average breakout time, this is from CrowdStrike, and they did a report this year. The average breakout time, which is the time it takes from compromising an initial endpoint to laterally moving, meaning I have enough credential to move out as an external threat actor, is an hour and I think it's 38 minutes.
Wow.
And it's down from 4 hours and 32 minutes or something like that in 2019. So in 3 years, they've cut down 3 hours, and the average is an hour and a half. So it's very much a target.
And I guess one of the big issues is that most of the people who are being targeted for vulnerabilities don't even recognize these vulnerabilities, right?
In a lot of cases,
just talked about some things that are new to me.
And in a lot of cases, they're actually 0-day vulnerabilities. There are literally ransomware gangs right now that are putting posts out on the dark web saying, I will pay for a 0-day exploit that gives me these kinds of access or this kind of something. And they're willing to pay, 7 figures for that, because then they can go and utilize that in their code and then take advantage of, before anyone recognizes they got 100,000 organizations or whatever the number is.
So training is very important for employees to make sure that they're aware of all these potential threats and risks, right?
As a side note, that's part of managing insider risk from a accidental, that kind of perspective. Yes.
You need to have the safeguards in place, and employees need to be aware of what's happening, right?
Agreed. Plus the layered security strategy, the email protection, and you get scanning email in a virtual sandbox, and maybe you've got DNS protection or web filtering. There's all kinds of other types of solutions that can come into play in a layered security strategy for sure. But at the end of the day, if something reaches an inbox, then it's the user. And once it gets past that, then we're talking about the endpoint. And then after that, we have to simply watch what the individual is doing and look at behavior.
Yeah. So we've talked a fair bit about what threats are up there and how organizations can be compromised and how employees can be exploited and vulnerabilities exploited. So, and we've talked about the difference between insider risk versus insider threat. So why should today's organizations be trying to manage insider risk as opposed to insider threats?
Okay, that's a good question. The first one, and I kind of insinuated this or maybe even said it before, you can't manage threats. I mean, you can respond to them, but you can't manage them. You can mitigate them, beforehand, but you can't manage them as they're happening. Like, okay, could you only steal this data but not that data? That's managing a threat, but that doesn't exist, right?
Yeah.
Instead, we're talking about you can manage risk. And the example I gave early on about the sales employee that's unhappy, there is potential risk there. There is risk. The risk exists, but it's not active yet. And you can manage it. You can actually say, let me do something about that problem. You could literally cut someone's access off. There, you manage the risk. It's gone. You mitigated the threat. And then it's kind of the same thing. Managing a risk is mitigating threats. It's really what we're talking about.
The corporate equivalent of not taking that slightly dubious alleyway that you mentioned in Manhattan, right? So
that's mitigating the threat. Yes.
You go a slightly longer route, but it actually is safer.
Well, that's only because they haven't replaced the lights in that hallway on the way to the bathroom and the way to the break room. But that's where the alleyway is. Apparently, in the office now, it's the corporate equivalent. But that's exactly it. So, and the other thing is with managing risk, it's put it this way: when those of you that are watching, when you're thinking about all the solutions you might have in place that are monitoring. It could be the network, could be monitoring logs, could be monitoring servers, could be whatever you're monitoring. And you look at all from that perspective, you are trying to find indicators that say something unusual has happened, right? And that's typically the route you take. But here's the problem: it has happened. The difference with managing risk typically is you're looking at behaviors, actions, same thing, but they are leading actions. In some cases, the very same solutions that are helping manage risk are actually going to identify a threat. Because maybe somebody didn't give it any indicators. They didn't use any of those, odd linguistics. They changed their, we's and us's to I's and me's, or they didn't look at any sites that showed that they were trying to look for a job. They just were very quiet and copied a bunch of files and then quit. Yeah, that does happen. It's not perfect, but the idea is that you can at least look for those leading indicators and try to figure out if something looks out of normal. And the beautiful part with solutions today, with artificial intelligence involved, if you were to take, let's say, watching users that have a lot of risk, like let's say people that manage portfolios of more than $5 million for some large bank, you could compare one portfolio manager with all of the portfolio managers, and now you get to see not just what's normal for them, but what's normal for a portfolio manager. What should they be normally doing? How much time in an application should they be spending? How often should they be copying files? How often do they print? Whatever it is. And what kind of language do they use in emails? And you get a sense of that with AI, and it can look at this overall in a way that you and I can't, and then figure out, Tommy is sort of acting a little odd. And then even if it's I'm not going to call it a false flag, but even if it's like, it just looks odd, but it's not really bad, at least then somebody looked at it and went, no, Tommy's just having a bad day. He's fighting with his wife, or whatever it is, or something. Yeah. At least somebody looked at it and helped manage the risk and realized there was no risk, or if there's something there, they deal with it.
Early indicator.
Right, exactly. I hope that answers your question.
So it does, absolutely, it does. And I was kind of, I think you've partially answered this question, but I'll ask it anyway. So I think is the work of focusing on insider risk different from focusing on insider threats? You've talked about some of, focusing on
in a conceptual way, I think I did, but in a practical way, I don't think I have yet. In a practical way, the difference of the work is this: the work of trying to address threats is either I put a bunch of stuff in place to mitigate them, or I build a lot of response plans of how I'm going to respond to them. Right? It could be using solutions that automatically isolate things, and then somebody comes and does investigation. Sure, all that. But that's the work, the practical work that happens. The practical work for managing risk is more about determining what defines, let's say, abnormal behavior. If you've got a solution in place that's using AI, you probably have to tweak. Hopefully it's as simple as moving a lever over, so you're getting like way too many indicators, too few indicators. You go, this one, it's the Goldilocks principle. This one's just right. They're finding out where the balance is, so that you're not just getting Tommy having a problem with his wife one day, and at the same time you're not missing Tommy thinking of leaving and stealing $4 million from a customer. At the same time, you have to find the balance there. But you're spending the time trying to tweak this to figure out, when am I getting the right level of indicators? Also, what groups need to be monitored, which could be literally everybody, because risk shifts within an organization. You don't know when someone's suddenly having their wife has cancer, they suddenly have gambling debts, they're suddenly in this bad place they weren't in 6 months ago, and now they're a problem. But the general rule is anyone who has access to something of value to the organization, which is kind of everybody. But it's a different set of practical kind of pieces of work that have to be done, different tasks. So, and then we're staying high level because we obviously only have a couple minutes to talk about it. We could do that for 2 hours and talk about the differences.
Oh, we can listen to you all morning, Nick.
I'm sure. Just
you're full
of your ears,
full of insights and information for us. Okay, so on to the next question. In your presentation, you mentioned an insider threat program. Should insider risk be handled separately or differently?
So the short answer is no. It's somewhat in there. At the time when we wrote that 3 years ago together, the focus in the industry was purely about the threat. And now we've matured our thinking. We've realized there's an opportunity to be more. There is some mention there about being proactive and doing that, but now we're realizing that there's an actual real opportunity. There's enough solutions. The AI is mature, that kind of thing that exists to really broaden the scope. And if I was to redo that, I probably would have a different bent on how you'd break out those maturity levels and probably keep something like non-existent and whatever the second one was. I'd have to go look. I remember them off the top of my head. It's been 3 years. I have my papers in front of me somewhere, I'm sure. Reactive. Those folks would be, purely just insider threat focused. And maybe the proactive folks would be now thinking about risk to some degree. And then certainly the folks that are over in like predictive, they're very much focused on risk and then have far more of a response plan should something get missed, but it's more of a just in case as opposed to that's our plan.
Yeah. Okay, that makes complete sense. So essentially 2 sides of the same coin, right?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Okay, I have one more question for you. How should our audience go about starting to manage their insider risk of their own organizations?
Okay, that's a very large question. The first part is, that's right. So step 1 in an 11-step process. No, it's not that bad. But so the first part is assessing what you have in place. I think in kind of a practical sense, it'd be probably looking at the solutions that you have, any processes, procedures. If you have a formalized insider threat program group, or a task force of some kind internally, assess what you have. It's kind of like doing an inventory, right? You can't upgrade all your machines to Windows 11 until you know what kind of machines you have or something and figure out are they compatible. And so you have to kind of look at the technology, but you're not looking at the technology from that perspective, but more so the perspective of will it help me achieve my goal? So I figure out, do an assessment and go from an insider risk perspective, how much of what we have is about risk and how much of what we have is about threats. That's what I do. And so it's almost like doing a gap analysis of somebody, or a risk analysis and going, where does what we have address risk or not? And it might be that you'll find, for those in the audience, you might find that most of what you have in place is really about stopping threats. So it's things like I have an email scanning, some kind of email protection solution in place that scans for phishing emails so that the bad stuff gets blocked, phishing attachments and links and those kind of things. Maybe you have something in endpoint protection so that something doesn't get launched and run on an endpoint. The threat actors try to run there. That's all about stopping threats. And then you have probably more than likely a response plan that if there is an insider threat, assuming that someone has an insider threat program in place, it's just the response actions. And it's things like security has to do things like lock down the machine, HR has to be notified, maybe we have to bring the user in and we have to talk to them, we have to tell them that they're being fired and that, if they stole any data, but according to the documents they signed, they have to return the documents, all that process stuff that happens after the fact of an insider threat being identified. And then you got to figure out what do we need to be doing? What's the gap that exists from, again, a process standpoint, a communication standpoint, and a technology standpoint to address risk. And let's give you an example that is not technical at all. And that's things like having an acceptable use policy, having some kind of document in place that it defines what's considered corporate data and what the expectation is of the employee when they leave, and you have them sign both of those when they start. So that way, should they leave, if someone's, let's say, oh, I'm quitting, and they're going to give up here's my 2 weeks notice or whatever, you probably want to bring them in. This is about mitigating risk, or sorry, addressing risk. There's still a risk, even if it's, let's say there's no indicators of a user at all doing anything malicious, but they're leaving. I have a process in place that has HR bring them in, heard you're leaving, we'll have an exit interview. Here's the document you signed that says when you leave, you promise you will not take any copies of anything of ours. If you have anything digital, you will destroy it. And if you don't, this is the repercussions. I just want to remind you of that.
Yeah.
See, that's about mitigating risk. And this assumes you have a solution in place in my head in this scenario, that you've already looked at Sally or Tommy or whoever's leaving, and they're not doing anything that seems, malicious to the organization. They're just leaving. Okay, fine. Well, we've just, at least from that perspective, we at least now try to manage some risk to say, just in case you do get the idea of doing that in the next 2 weeks, don't. Because you signed something. Oh, maybe I shouldn't, and then I was scared, right? That's just an example. But the technical side is what do we need to be monitoring? Who do we need to be monitoring? And how should we be monitoring? And then coming up with processes based on that. So that the how should be a solution that's using AI, looking at the behavior of the users. So that's really in-depth, understanding what they're doing both in the cloud and on premises. And then having processes that say, what do we do should that happen? Because it shouldn't just be like, we should just have IT go and look at everything they do. That could be some privacy issues. Maybe it should get HR involved. Maybe you have to bring the entire ITP team inside a threat program team in, and they have to agree. Okay, we think timing might be a risk. We've all signed off on it. So and so will go in and review the last 30 days, whatever it is. But you have to come up with this process. That's why I said it's a very big question. But there's a lot that has to be done. So it's sort of do an analysis of what you have in place, how that pertains truly to risk. Thinking back to the grid that I had, how risk was different than threats. And how that applies to risk, figure out what your gaps are, and then figure out what solutions, what processes, what communication, what team changes are necessary so that you're actually actively managing risk in addition to the managing of threats, or I should say the addressing of threats. And then if you don't have anything at all, maybe you're in the audience is in the reactive column of my maturity model that we built together a couple of years back, then I would say, okay, so you have nothing. You have no ITP program. You're not even thinking about insider threats. You're really here today because you're going, I don't know the difference, but I know we have to worry about insiders. I would probably tell you to be thinking about a layered security strategy to help prevent external threats. But then I would probably focus more on solutions that are helping with insider risk. And the reason for that is if they're already watching what an individual is doing from a risk perspective, and typically solutions that do that are also recording actions, maybe even recording screens or doing screenshots or something, there is always this component where you can reactively go back and do investigations using the very same solution. And so from that perspective, those of you, again, are in this, I don't even know what I'm doing yet, or we're just getting started. We just know we want to address insider, threats, insider risk, whatever, Nick, whatever you want to call it. I just need to address it. That kind of a solution that really would help you with risk is going to also help you with threats, because now you can do those things like look for the indicators of compromise or understand the scope. You figure out the person stole 50 files instead of 5,000 files, or give you a really good example, real world example. I've been a VP of marketing for 3 tech companies. And in one of them, there was a sales guy who was very non-technical. Certainly he could work his computer and that kind of thing. But like when he would sell software to people, he wasn't talking technical. He would say, well, this little buddy right here. And he would talk about it being software that way. He was very folksy and conversational and built rapport with his customers. So when he left that company and went to the next company, that'd be the one that I was working at, he's old school. He printed out his customer records from Salesforce and then manually typed them in again.
Wow.
Right. And he wasn't trying to be malicious. He was just like, they're my customers. I've had these same customers for, X number of years. Maybe there's some truth in that. Maybe he should have had access. I don't know. But, from a company standpoint, we'd all go, no, that's not yours. Those are the companies or whatever. But the idea here is with the same tool that maybe could show he was looking to go leave. Maybe he's emailing back and forth about here's a copy of my resume. And, you can just look up literally someone who puts the word resume in anything. In an email, in a web browser, whatever, and that would be a leading indicator that might be something going on, and now you have to minimize the risk. Why are you leaving? Is there anything we can do to keep you here? Then they don't steal the data and all that. But the same tool would have been able to show you, if you didn't have it tracked beforehand after the fact that he printed out, 175 printouts from Salesforce. That's really odd. Now, it should have triggered something beforehand.
Or even productivity levels, whether the employee
Sure.
is lacking productivity over a number of weeks in the run up to doing something different.
That's a great example as well. I mean, anything like that could help. So the same solution would probably. So that's where I would tell people to start. So if you've got something formal, I kind of gave you the high level, 20,000 foot view formal answer. But if you've got nothing formal, then I would start with at least a solution. And then that way you have something we've got both sides of that risk and threat coin.
Absolutely. Okay, great. Well, that's incredibly helpful and insightful, Nick. That was all the questions I had for now. I don't want to overload everybody.
Well, actually, before you did you touched on productivity. I think we should talk about that just for a second.
Okay.
I think that's kind of important here. There's also this focus these days on employee productivity, especially them being remote. And there's not butts in the seat anymore. And that was always sort of the standard. Everyone's got to be here. I can see them. I can walk around. I can see them in their cubicles. So don't forget the productivity side of this thing as well, David, just from the standpoint of, I think your point of just watching productivity, and that could be something as sort of, I'll call it metric based, as like, number of minutes in Salesforce, for that sales rep I was talking about before. But obviously they could be spending all those minutes printing out something. So not exactly the right, that's sort of a very, kind of caveman, he was in Salesforce, good, that's it. It doesn't really help. You gotta be smarter than that. But then also looking at maybe if users have a good set of work habits, there's ways to look at what really, really good, efficient employees are doing.
Logging on and logging off times are changing over a period of time, or there's long lunch breaks happening. There's just general decline in productivity tends to be a sign of disengagement, right? So
and that's another angle here. Whether it applies to cybersecurity, which it does, or if we're just really talking about purely organizations want to measure employee productivity, you do have insight into the employee and what they're doing. So the information is there. It's just a question of using it for that purpose as well.
Also a way of seeing which tools are actually being used or not. Are you spending a lot of money on certain packages you don't really need?
100%.
Okay, look, that's a whole other conversation, and perhaps we could have a follow-up webinar at some point that focuses on the productivity angle of software solutions like this. I think we'll wrap up the Q&A section there. Nick, thank you so much for your time. It's been really helpful and very, very insightful. And just a reminder to the audience, this is being recorded, so we can't answer your questions live, unfortunately. Next time we will do that. But please do ask your questions. Just put them in the chat, and we will download those questions, and we'll get back to you with answers right after the broadcast, which I believe is tomorrow. So thank you for that. For the final part of this morning's webinar, I'm going to hand it over to Suzanne Parent, who is Senior Director of Enterprise and Channel Sales at Awareness Technologies, the parent company of Veriado. And Suzanne is going to give a bit of an overview into our solution. So over to you, Suzanne.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Nick, for a lot of the insightful messages. And I've picked up a few things. So I wrote them down, and I'm going to bring them up as well throughout this portion. So what I'm going to do is kind of give you an overview of the platform from the Veriado brand of awareness. And I'm going to talk about Cerebral. You talked about preempting, protection, reduce costs. Those are really important keywords, but they're also important on how do you do that? Where is all that information residing? How do you actually look at it? So the platform that we're going to look at is looking at 3 areas. So you talked about insider threat, insider risk. Those terms are going to be coming throughout the presentation. We talked about, you just mentioned productivity and engagement versus disengagement. Those are the capabilities that we're going to look at. And then finally, an organization has compliance. It could be governmental compliance or even policies within an organization, and how to really track individuals who are either following the compliance or not. So those are key pieces that could indicate as well the threat or the risk. So what do we look at? We're looking at a platform, one platform that covers the 3 areas you mentioned. We're talking about behavior. We're talking about monitoring the activities. So that's what we refer to as user activity monitoring, or UAM. And of course, part of that is a combination of those two pieces, the UEBA, so the behavior analytics, and the monitoring to make up the risk score. So a risk score will be a combination of up to 25 different variables of all this data that's collected to really identify, talked about investigation or you talk about mitigation. Mitigate, investigate. Which one really takes on the importance in your organization? All this put together with an AI platform will give you some information to determine if it's an investigation or a mitigation. One of the things that's very difficult is to try to build a model. How does your platform react? Where does your platform need to be? Well, part of the thing is building data sets, and data sets, so what we call synthetics, is trying to recreate an environment in order to test it to see if it actually gives you anything. So one of the organizations in Palo Alto created a set of data, which is about 500 days worth of data of individuals that work throughout different conditions that are threat or risk. And we've tested our platform against those in order to be able to determine if the data is accidental, like you mentioned earlier, opportunistic, if it's focusing on fraud, financial fraud, or sabotage. These are terms that are important when you're actually building a data set. So we've tested against it, and we're using it every time we test the platform. So let's talk about a little bit of the insider risk security and compliance. And Nick mentioned quite a bit of it. And what does it mean? So working remote, of course, is a compliance nightmare. What does that mean? Of course, that file that was residing in the file server is no longer there. It's sitting in your kitchen. It's sitting in a coffee shop. And it's okay as long as the communication is still there. But what if the communication breaks? You're now in violation of a compliance. The platform that we have continues to collect the data. So it doesn't stop from monitoring the information. Where's the file? What are they doing to it? Are they moving it? And then the data continues to be sent to the servers. So now the data is in the database that gives you the ability to see it. We can extend that even further because I was talking more or less with the VPN type communication. Well, now we're looking at a multitude of users, and I suspect that in the near future, we will see a lot less people going back to the office and staying remote, where most employees, potentially up to 50 to 60% of the employees, are now going to be remote. And your capabilities of tracking all this information is even more important. What do we track? Where do we track it? What kind of information from what kind of devices? So there, of course, the Microsoft operating system devices, the Mac OS, the Android devices, and newly added, the Chrome devices. And there's a tendency to have smaller devices now with the Chrome platforms. So what does the data do? All the data that we're collecting at each one of these endpoints is sent, and these are all remote users or they're in the office, so it doesn't have any difference. The data is actually sent back to the server. And it's at that point that all the analytics that we were mentioning earlier that Nick was talking about is all the analytics, all the capabilities to alert you of a threat, to alert you of potentially a mitigation that you need to act on. So being more proactive versus reactive. So all that data is residing in a SQL database. It's managed through a management console. You can deploy it on premise, you can deploy it in a VM, and you can deploy it in a cloud environment, whether it's private or public. So all this infrastructure is yours to manage. Now, of course, there's a lot of data points that we're collecting in order to give you all this information. Let's just talk about the file transfers. We're talking about data exfiltration, data breaches. How many documents are being sent? What are they doing to them? Deleting them, editing, renaming. There's a lot of different capabilities. So we have the ability to track and log all this information. We talk about applications used, behavior changes, potentially accessing an application that they're not supposed to access. Well, that would fall into a behavior analytics piece. So we have the ability to know if today they were accessing an application that they don't normally use. That's a resource use that you could be alerted on. So now you've got the behavior piece. You've got all the printed documents, any emails that are sent, even all the way down to BCC. BCC, you're copying yourself or potentially copying somebody else. We're able to track that and report whenever someone does that. Any chat activities that could be detrimental, or even now the chats, you can attach files. So now you've got another exfiltration place where people can send things. The websites that they visit, how much time they spend. And of course, we added, and that's a little bit of a difference from a lot of other platforms, we're looking at psycholinguistics. What is that? Psycholinguistics is where we're looking at what Nick was mentioning about the me versus the us, the I, the ability to know when the tone of an email is negative or positive. So any of those changes, again, that's a part of that we've included, is all included in the AI machine learning capabilities. So you have to look at that. The platform, how does the platform work? Is a really sneak peek in terms of how our platform works. You can check and track all the users through all their devices, see when they checked in, see where all the licenses are, anybody that's registered as a device. So the whole platform that you're looking at endpoint agents, you're looking at the systems, you're looking at reports, and we have over 115 dashboards already created and ready to be seen. And those are all organized by people, by group. You can look at them any way you need to cut and dice it, like an OLAP cube, you basically, or a Rubik's Cube if you like. You basically can turn around the data and look at it the way you need to. You can search data in the database and you can report. We have already 80 reports ready to look at. One step further is you want to export, or you want to take that data and you want to feed it into a SIEM platform. That takes your analysis even one step further, because now your SIEM platform, whether it's Splunk or any other platform that you're using, you can then add other and ingest other pieces of data in that analysis and in those graphics. When you're looking at a risk score, so earlier I talked about user behavior analytics. So we look at behavior changes from a baseline. It takes about 30 days to build a baseline. And from that baseline, you can see some of the changes. We'll combine all that with all the data that we were looking at earlier that we're grouping. So those 25 variables will build a risk score. And every single user will get a risk score based on their activity level of those variables. So it's important to see, what do you do in the morning? Well, you can choose to go straight and look at every single user. If they're in the red, well, that's your first step. So you begin to proactively look at a user from their behavior. Potentially their behavior is, false positive. But again, there's a lot of things that were mentioned earlier during the first part was, you'll at least have looked at it and you'll say, okay, in this case, makes okay, or there's something I need to look at that's a little fishy. I'm going to go check it out. That's a lot of data we keep. It's a lot of information that is accessible to the administrator or the manager. So we want to make sure that the data has a role-based capability. So every single group can be assigned to a particular manager. So you have different abilities to do role-based permissions. One more step deeper is, well, what can you give them as features? So you can turn on and off those capabilities as needed for each access, each person who has access, and even more so, those pieces of data. So you're looking at chats or keystrokes or file transfers. You can turn those on or off for viewing capabilities. And we also have screenshots. So every single event is taken over the day. Every 30 seconds, we take a screenshot. So if there was an alert or something that occurred, you can always look back at each one of those. So what's a complete insider threat intelligence platform? It's a combination of us or the platform watching the users, gathering the data, analyzing the data, and alerting the administrator or alerting the manager that there's something that needs to be done. After that, that whole threat, that whole program is really going to be built on what am I going to look at so you can see it, and how am I going to react to it. So building that insider threat or insider risk program will really depend on what am I going to do once I see that. That's part of what you need to do when you put a program in place. But you don't need to wait before you have a program in order to start gathering the data for future information. Investigate, mitigate. Those are the two pieces that you really need to remember and how they work within the platform that you choose. You want to see the data, eyes on the glass technology, which means that you can see, view the records, you can see it through dashboards, reports, you can search the database. There's a lot of information that is now accessible to you. That was a short environment, a short view of the solution, but I encourage you to schedule your demo as soon as possible. And we can go through even more. There's layers and layers of information that we would be able to cover with you. So with that, I've covered my piece, and I want to thank you for attending, and we look forward to seeing you on the next one. And the next one is scheduled, I have it right here, it's scheduled for April 13, 11 a.m. Eastern Daylight Savings Time. And the title of this next one is Human-Centric Approach to Data Loss Prevention. So that's the subject for the next one, and I look forward to seeing you there. Thank you very much.